Hello everybody, it's Chris here again, and I've got a treat for you today. Perhaps it'll cheer you up during these short dark days. I'd like to show you a wonderful collection of Percy Kelly's work, mainly his oil paintings. Well, there'll be a few stories thrown in, of course. But Percy Kelly's oils are beautiful and they're very rare. As far as I can tell, having handled and studied his work for almost 30 years, he never did more than 30 oils. But I've learned never to say never in connection with Percy. This video is about some surprises and some exciting discoveries. I told you in the last video about Percy, about why Brian Kelly changed his mind about getting his father's work back to Cumbria. Well, it took me more than 2 years to find the answer to this, and I'll share it with you now. Just to remind you, Percy Kelly died intestate in Norfolk in July 1993, aged 75. In the absence of a signed will, Percy's only son, Brian, inherited everything. Probate was granted fairly promptly because the solicitor had declared that there wasn't much of value in Pear Cottage. What? I don't think the solicitor could actually judge artwork then. He said also that Percy had died destitute, which is quite true. Just one look round the door of the cottage would confirm that. Percy's son Brian hadn't seen his father for 27 years. He left school at 16, joined the Merchant Navy, and years later, when he came home, his father was gone. He'd never tried to contact him or find out where he was, not even a birthday or Christmas card. When I first met Brian Kelly at the gallery, he was off down to Norfolk to clear the house of all the perceived rubbish. This is Magpie Lane in Rockland St Peter in Norfolk, and there is Percy Kelly's Pear Tree Cottage on the right. Brian had never owned a house. I told him how important his father's work was, but really he was clearly not believing me at all. I tried again and told him that his father's work was worth infinitely more value than the broken down old cottage. But he was again telling me that he was taking 2 weeks off his work on a production line in a factory, was a job he told me he hated, to clear out the rubbish and put the house on the market. And so he left, intending to have the most expensive bonfire ever. Joan, David and I spent a stressful 2 weeks worrying about what was happening at Pear Tree. I was astonished then when Brian Kelly turned up at the gallery after he'd come back from Norfolk and announced that he'd decided to get the work back to Cumbria. I was astounded. What had happened in that 2 weeks to so radically change Brian's mind? He'd set off determined to clear out the cottage. He was convinced I was a charlatan, and he was not a decisive man. So it took me 2 years to find out what had happened to change his mind so dramatically and bring about this little miracle. I put some nice boats and suns for you to look at, again very cheery up, while I tell you the next bit of the story. Brian and his wife Doreen went down to Norfolk after Brian had spoken to me, and they stayed in a farm cottage belonging to Jackie and David Raleigh. Really lovely people who've been very kind to Percy. They were the owners of a large farm estate nearby. And they told me this story years and years later. When Doreen and Brian arrived, Brian mentioned to David that he'd been told the work was worth a lot of money, and he really didn't believe it, but he didn't know what to do. Nor did David, but being a man of decision, practical and very well connected, he rang an old school friend who had a weekend place nearby. The friend worked in London for Phillips Auction House. So David explained about the cottage and the stuff inside. How much is there? The man asked warily. I don't know. There's a lot of it, David told him. It's everywhere. Well, can you just bring 5 pieces? I'm just going fishing. These were selected at random, and when they got there, Brian wouldn't go in the house. He sat outside in the car. David took the 5 paintings in and laid them on the kitchen table. His friend stood there and took one long look. Then he said, "David, I thought you were bringing me a Sunday painter. Who owns these?" The son," David replied. Where is he?" He's outside in the car." "Oh, well, fetch him in," he said. Brian came in uneasily. He was very uncomfortable. "Now then, Brian," he said, "these aren't paintings of Norfolk, are they? Where was your father from?" Brian became unduly subservient. He's from Cumbria, sir." "What was his name?" "Percy Kelly, sir." I don't recognise that name. Did he show in any galleries?" "I don't know, sir." He looked at David, the friend looked at David, who shook his head and said, "There are hundreds in the house. I don't think he's ever sold any anywhere. We never knew if he was any good. He was so poor, we assumed his work wasn't worth anything. I had to take paints and crayons to him when he was in hospital, but I never really saw what he did." "Ah, well," said his friend, "for a start off, they need to go back to Cumbria." He looked at Brian. "There's a very good gallery there. I think it's called Castlegate House." Brian suddenly stood up very straight and said proudly, "I have been there, sir. It's in Cockermouth. I met the woman there. Her name's Chris. She said they're worth a lot of money. Is that right?" "Well, potentially, yes, they are," said the friend. "You need to get them to her. She'll sort them out and have an exhibition, possibly, where your father originated. If she plays her cards right, they'll do very well, and they'll really go places." And he went off fishing. Now, I'm amazed by this. I was when I heard it. I don't know the name of this man. I've never had dealings with Phillips. At that time, the gallery was barely 5 years old, so its reputation wasn't established. So how did he know? Perhaps he had another school friend in Cumbria. The old boys' network, eh? I really don't know, but I'm so thankful to that man for saving Percy's work for all of us. So, the work arrived and I set about cataloguing it. Few of them had signatures, even fewer had a title, and almost none were dated. I put each one in an acid-free transparent envelope and stuck a blank label on it. So what should I put on the label as a title? Each had to have something to distinguish it from the rest. There were places I recognised and many more that I didn't. It was through Joan and Percy's prolific letter writing to a variety of people that was my salvation. Over the years, I've had access to thousands of letters, lots of collections of letters, and they were full of information, including letters to the poet Norman Nicholson, to Peter Scott of Provincial Insurance, Lord Eccles, Lord and Lady Webb. And these letters told me about the man and his extraordinary life in detail. It was not so much the content, but the illustration. Each one of them was a masterpiece. This is the classic one that was sent to Joan, not that long after she'd known him, I think. 1988. She met him in 1983. It's 83. She met him in 1983 for the first time. But most of these letters to Joan and to everybody else are so heart-achingly beautiful that people have kept them. They've looked after them. The only ones lost, as far as I know, were those he sent to his eldest sister, Sally, who had to go into care, and they were all lost then in a skip. And the most tantalising, the letters he sent to his first wife, Brian's mother Audrey, when he was in the Royal Signals in the war. She threw them on the fire after they were read. I bet they were fascinating, as he served in France and Germany. He met Winston Churchill in the cabinet war rooms where he manned the teleprinter, and he was given the free run of an art room at Repton School when posted near Derby. Just as an example, this is a letter packed with information that Percy sent to Jane Buckmaster, known as Sammy to friends. She lived next door to Joan David, who was Percy's chief correspondent in Kendal, and when Sammy fell seriously ill in autumn 1983, Percy started to write to her to cheer her up. She was thrilled at first, anybody would be, but after some time her condition worsened and she just didn't have the energy to reply to them. Also, his letters were gloomy. A lot of them were about people who died and about his many afflictions, real and imagined. He even wrote one about watching television and somebody was making a coffin. Not really tactful, was it, to somebody so ill? So after some time, Joan had to stop him writing to her tactfully. And Joan tipped me off, and I went down to Kendal immediately and I bought the whole collection from Sammy. I learned a lot from this letter. I learned a lot from every letter, but this in particular. The actual writing in green ink is not of much interest, but the drawing of the interior of his room is. Christmas is fast approaching. You can tell that because the date's on the television screen. It's December 1983. Chris had left him in March earlier that year. This would be the first time in his life that he'd lived alone. Coming from a big family, all crowded into a small house in Workington, 7 children, mum and dad and granddad. And then he went into digs in Kendal when he won a job at Kendal Post Office in the 30s, when unemployment was really serious. He won a handwriting competition. And then he was living with others in the army barracks during the war. He married Audrey in 1943 while he was home on leave and returned to the UK in 1946 to live with her in the family home. They moved about a bit but were always together, and after his divorce he lived with Chris, who became his second wife. And when he wrote this letter, he was alone and he didn't like it. Look at the beautifully written label on the bread trays. Can you see the pile of bread trays with some books on top? Export, it says. Export? What was all that about? Percy didn't want to sell anything to anyone. He wanted it all around him. When I bought that letter from Sammy, I didn't dare to dream that in a few years I'd be in receipt of all those bread trays and their overflowing contents. And I would discover that the labels, there were others on the others, Cumberland, Prince, Lithos, Exports, meant nothing. They were fiction. He had just tossed everything randomly into the trays. This drawing in the letter is a tidied up version of the place. Joan told me it was chaotic even then and got rapidly worse each time she visited him. She only visited him about 5 times in her life. It was easier for him to tidy up in a drawing, it was rather a different matter in reality, as we all know. In this letter, he has virtually framed some of his work and hung it on the wall. He often did this in interior drawings. I had no idea that these would end up in the studio at Castlegate. I had sorted tray after tray of stunning paintings, drawings, prints on bits and pieces of poor quality paper, on used envelopes and cereal packets, even on blotting paper in his paint cloth. All the paintings I was so carefully listing and labelling was work on paper of varying quality. I must say it's sad to see the large packet of handmade Japanese paper, which is leaning on the trolley just below the television. I knew by then that it had been specially sought out in London by Lord Eccles, who had been Minister of Arts under Harold Macmillan, who had befriended Percy and tried to help him. This parcel is still unopened. You can see the band round it. That was a dark blue band round white paper. And it was still unopened when he arrived, or when it arrived at Castlegate House. If only. I smiled at the complan. Complan, says the ad. The complete meal. Complan was Percy's staple diet. The copy decks and the pincers were in readiness for his picture framing attempts. He would spend hours, days framing odd pictures, badly, when if he had just sold one of them, he could have had them professionally framed, giving him time to paint many more. That pile of scrapbooks you can see above the bread trays were on the van as well, and they were full of beautiful little paintings, each page protected by a cellophane sheet. Do you see the model of a fishing boat on top of on the shelf above the television? He gave the boat the number PKZ4. PZ is the Penzance code number for fishing boats. He's put his own initial in it, and there's just a hint of the book press behind the dividing curtain, which is now on my bench and comes in very useful at straightening out Percy's scrumpled paper. This is a photograph of the same room, the same door, and I can recognise, and maybe not the same curtain, I bet it is though, and I can recognise so many of those paintings. They too were on the van when they came up from Pear Tree Cottage. This scrap of paper is another interior of Pear Tree some time on, but undated. It's in the middle part of his big living room kitchen. There was just one big room downstairs. Well, it wasn't that big, actually. It's the same TV as before, but things have deteriorated. There is a painting, an abstract, based on boats in Cornwall, that's hanging across the door to the stairs. That door behind it is the door to the stairs, and it leads to his bedroom. And we know that the stairs are unusable, blocked with paintings, and that his bed is piled high with clothes and paintings and rubbish. He sleeps in this chair. Well, it's not a chair really. It's a car seat that he rescued from a skip. I've learned all that from letters of his. And this is where he sits to write his illustrated letters and to go through his paintings of Cumbria, adding bits and strengthening lines here and there. There's a piece of wood resting on the arms, supported by a wooden stool. And he's written this, in Reading this time. I am hoping Ina will not come over tomorrow, Thursday, because there is no space to sit down. A chair for her to sit on. This is the setup at the moment, a tabletop supported by a small table and the one and only chair. The snag is, Ina is especially tubby, so she requires a very strong and substantial seat. The table is not alone because there are lots of scrapbooks and sketches spread around. Normally she could sit in my chair and I could use a small hardback one, but the condition of my old back rules this out. All the paintings I was so carefully recording had come from this place. It was work on paper of varying quality. There were mostly watercolours, gouache, which is watercolour as well, just rather thicker, kids' crayons, pastels, charcoals, anything that made a mark. But I only found one oil painting. It's this one. It's superb. It's a bowl of apples on thin hardboard. I was thrilled when I saw that. Could there be more? Later I found a painting of apples in gouache and put it with the oil, as they seemed to go together perfectly. And it was a source of great regret to me that there were no more oils by the time I'd got through the whole lot. There were lots of messy paint boxes and gouache tubes, brushes, printing inks, bottles of fixative and thinner, but no tubes of oil paints. I assumed then that his whole life's work was on the van, and knowing his total reluctance to let anything go. So there can't be any more oil paintings, I thought, wrongly. I bought the oil and the gouache after the second Percy exhibition. Each exhibition had a queue outside. It was a sellout. There were queues forming before the opening. But little did I know the surprises and excitements and discoveries that lay ahead. I didn't see another oil until I visited Joan David, PK's friend, correspondent, for the last time. She was about 80 and was very frail. She'd become a close friend over our common interest in art, in Percy and in his welfare, and she had a parcel for me. "I want you to have this," she said, handing it to me. "You can open it now if you want. I've been saving it for you for a long time. I was going to leave it to you in my will, but you may as well have it now." It was this, an oil painting of a farm, very close to Cockermouth. "Farmhouse near Dovenby," it said on the label on the back. She dated and inscribed it to me as well. I thanked and hugged her, and we both shed a tear. I love that painting. If it hadn't been for Joan and her love of art, I would never have... Oh, well, it doesn't bear thinking about. Joan was an exceptional person, and I will never sell it. If you drive from Cockermouth on the Maryport road, you see the farm on the left. It's still the same, and I never go past it without thinking of Joan and her kindness. After the divorce in 1970, Percy's first wife, Audrey, remarried. She sold Glen Cottage in Allenby, and she and Bob were living in a bungalow in Cockermouth. I saw very little of her. I invited her to all our openings, but she didn't come, not even to Percy's shows. She didn't like his work. When her only son Brian died in 2000, aged 54, ironically in the middle of his father's last exhibition at the gallery, he and Doreen had divorced and he had no children. He left everything to his mother, who was now in her late 70s. Audrey lived in perpetual darkness. She had an eye condition, she said. She couldn't stand daylight. There were a lot of things Audrey couldn't stand. So I called at the bungalow, the first time after Brian's death, to hand over a large cheque for the exhibition. I was so surprised to see this oil painting of Colbeck on her sitting room wall. By then, I'd handled well over 1,000 paintings, and only one was an oil, my apples. "I didn't know Percy worked in oils, Audrey," I said. "He didn't," she replied. "I stopped that. I couldn't bear the smell of all that turps and stuff, very messy. Gave me a headache, brought on a migraine." I looked pointedly at this magnificent painting. "Oh, that," she said. "It's not bad, is it? I like Colbeck. I've got another oil somewhere, but it's dark brown and boring." "Where is it? Can I see it?" I said. "Oh, it's in the spare room," and she called Bob to get it out to show me. "See what I mean? It's depressing. Put it away now, Bob, I don't like it." So I persevered. "Percy only did these 2 oils then?" She agreed. I found myself looking forward to my meetings with Audrey, if only to see these oil paintings. I longed to open the curtains and let some light in to see them properly. It was some time after this that I got a phone call from Audrey, and she said, "Hello, Chris. Bob's in the loft. We're having a big tidy up. He's been up there all day. I've never been up there, but he's just said there's some bits of hardboard that could be paintings. They might be by Percy." "I don't think so, but you did say I'd to call you if I found anything. The people who sold this house, they left us a lot of junk. But if you've got a minute, perhaps you could pop over." Knowing Audrey, I thought I'd better go straight away. And knowing Audrey, I didn't really hold out much hope of a PK find. The ladder was down in the hall when I got there, and there was a load of dust and chaos everywhere. A dirty face appeared from above, and Bob was a man of few words. "Hello, Bob," I said. "What you found?" "Dunno," he said. "I don't think it's oak, but there's a lot of it." "Like what?" I said. "Oh, bits of hardboard. It's all mucky up here. Think somebody did a roof repair and didn't clean up. There's rubble, soot and muck everywhere." "Can you just pass one piece down, please, Bob?" There was a lot of banging and crashing, and a filthy piece of hardboard was passed down. It didn't look as though there was anything on it at all. I took it in the sitting room and showed it to Audrey. "What do you think?" she asked, her lip curling. Can you see anything? 'Cause I can't. Well, let's be sure, I said. Do you mind if I take this back to the gallery and have a good look? It looked promising. The hardboard was like the one my apples was painted on. When I got back with a bit of hardboard wrapped in newspaper, I got a soft sponge and a bowl of warm water with a drop of fairy liquid in it and wiped the hardboard. I hoped that the fairy liquid was as kind to paint as it had been to hands. The water soon turned black, and a haystack appeared all yellow. A white house suddenly appeared in contrast to the brown fells. There were some tiny scattered buildings, and the sky was lighting up the fells as a backdrop. It's just gorgeous. And it all appeared. I could rub quite hard because the oil paint was really firm and dry and smooth. I remembered I'd catalogued a small charcoal drawing of haystacks, and he'd written Lawton on it at the bottom. I'd put anything with a clue to its whereabouts in a special box. I rang and told Audrey I was coming round to show her the cleaned painting. She took one look and sent Bob back up the ladder. I'd changed into gardening clothes and took each slab of mucky hardboard from him and placed it on an old sheet I'd spread in the hall. This haystacks one must have been top of the heap because these were not quite as dirty, and they were very exciting. There were about 25 pieces. I took them all away and gave them all the same expert treatment. And they shone. They shimmered. They were wonderful. By the time my assistant Angie arrived next morning, they were arrayed round the kitchen. "Hi, Angie," I said. "Welcome to the first exhibition of Kelly oil paintings." And I laughed. "Where'd you get those?" said Angie. "Look at this." And she picked up this one, the red house. "Do you know," she said, "I think we've got a small sketch of that house. It's near Thursby." And she fetched it down from the store later. Here's the sketch he did. He made little visual notes on things so that he knew what was what, like the window at the side. There isn't actually a window in the oil painting. This is Christchurch in Maryport, the one that's just got the Grade 2 listing. How does he get that purity of colour, especially his reds? Percy was particularly proud of his reds. He often put a slash of bright red in an otherwise dull painting, drawing or charcoal. I found out in a letter to Rosanna, a fellow student at Carlisle College of Art. He had described mixing printing ink and printing just a red square on a large piece of paper in the print room. He was not the first and not the last to do this. Here we are. This is Percy's red square. The Russian painter Malevich was obsessed with red squares. Very much like this. Well, he would be, wouldn't he, being Russian? I was interested this year to see that Cornelia Parker, R.A., had done the same thing in the summer exhibition. It was simply a printed red square festooned with red spots. Quite witty, I thought. We carried on round the kitchen exhibition. "Gosh," said Angie, "that must be Parton," when I got to this one. Parton, the hidden village of interesting shapes. It's wedged between the sea and the main road on the cliff top north of Whitehaven. "There's a painting of that," said Angie, and she rushed up to the studio and found the painting and drawing he'd done of this particular viewpoint. Parton was one of his favourite sources of inspiration. We had a lot of toing and froing that morning, up and down to the store. I'm surprised we ever managed to open the doors to the public. Each one of these oils was a miracle, and each one had an area of white showing the contrast. They were stark and linear and so attractive. This is the White House. Neither of us even tried to speculate where they were. That wasn't the point. They were solid, simple, clever, beautiful. You could actually believe in them because they were so solid. Evening West Cumbria. These oils, all of them, had a lack of distracting detail. This is Farm West Cumberland. It's the essence of simplicity. The juxtaposition of the buildings are masterly and minimal again. This is a gouache that was done of the same red barn. I don't think any of the actual barns were red. Some had sold, but I found these images on the inventory, and this is one of them. I don't think any of them were actually red in reality, but they make the picture, don't they? They make it alive and balanced. He loved a vertical, usually a telegraph pole, and dry stone walls and curving grass verges. He puts a lot more detail, you'll notice, in watercolours. The oils are flat and textureless. They're very simple. It's so hard to achieve that simplicity while making it seem easy, and such a pleasing for the eye arrangement. The Spectator art critic Andrew Lambeth called it earthbound magic. This one is House by the Bridge. Percy's love of bridges comes to the fore. I can't even count the number of House by the Bridge paintings there are. It's difficult when titling them, I tell you. But again, we've got one of the watercolours, I think it's gouache, of the same bridge. This is Red Bridge, and it's that gorgeous shade of red which he claimed to be like no other. If he was alive today, he would be claiming it as Kelly Red, like Anish Kapoor's recent claim to a unique black on which he has slammed a copyright. First snow. By this time I was beside myself with excitement, and I shot round to show them all to Audrey. Meanwhile, back at the bungalow, Audrey was quite indifferent. She didn't share my excitement. She very quickly agreed that they should be sold. She didn't want them. I took the 10 I've just shown you up to Edinburgh and got them beautifully framed with a white plaster slip and a hand-gilded dull gold frame made by a master framer called Sean in Leith. Sean loved every one of them. She was really thrilled and hoped I was going to bring more. She just couldn't stop looking at them. Back in Cockermouth, I went to the bungalow to show Audrey one of the finished, framed. Bob was out at the Conservative Club. Audrey was passively sitting in her usual chair. In the dark. She denied knowing anything about how they got from Allenby to Cockermouth. I will never find that out. She seemed to resent my excitement and began her usual tirade about Percy. She wanted to justify her feelings about him and emphasise how cruel he'd been towards her, how he'd be out sunbathing all day when she was slaving at a typewriter at Dovenby Hospital. She went on to tell me about her divorce. There were things she wanted me to know. This was her account, as well as I remember it. When we lived at Glen Cottage in Allenby, she said, I got home one dark winter evening. I was working full-time at the hospital as a secretary. I parked the car and was hoping that my husband had at least lit the fire, as there was a deep frost and I was cold. He would have been out messing about with paint and stuff, she said, all day. The 4 years at Carlisle College of Art had gone to his head and made him even more obsessed with it. Art's a hobby, she said to me emphatically. It should be a hobby. I didn't want him to go to that college, but I agreed to it because I thought that with a degree he could have got a teaching job, not leaving me to work my fingers to the bone. But as I walked past the sitting room window, she said, I could see the firelight through the curtains, and I was glad he was home, and he'd lit the fire, obviously. I went in and I took my coat off, and I walked to the sitting room and was startled to see a strange woman sitting there with her back to the door. She was sitting in front of the fire. I was frightened. Who are you? I asked. And the figure turned and held out a wand of mascara. It was Percy. "Can you help me with this?" he said in a silly voice. I was revolted. I felt sick. This was my husband, and he had on bright red lipstick, my lipstick, and was wearing my woolen Jaeger dress. I was so angry. I knocked the mascara out of his hand, and I threw him out. I did. I showed him the door. As he got to the door, I noticed he'd got my high heel shoes on, the ones that had gone missing a long time ago. He'd cut the backs out. He was very tall and had big feet. I told him to come back in the morning and take his stuff, and the books, and the locks would be changed that afternoon before I got home from work. I told him he wouldn't get in after that, and I never wanted to see him again. "Where did he go, Audrey?" I asked. "Well, I don't know, and I don't care." I found out many years later that Percy and a fellow student at Carlisle College, Barry Dunlinson, had rented a studio over at Snow Hill, Colbeck, after they'd left college, and Percy had driven over there that evening and crept back the next day and filled his van several times over with his work. In that small, tight village of Allenby, nobody saw him that night in the Jaeger dress and high heels get into his car and drive off. That would have been a scandal and a source of gossip for months. He was dressed in his normal painting clothes when he returned next morning, so nobody suspected a thing. But Audrey's still sitting in her sitting room, now obviously relieved that she'd told me everything. "But he didn't get everything," she said triumphantly. I was stunned. What do you mean, Audrey?" "Ah, what he could fit into the car." "It's what he couldn't fit into the car, isn't it? I binned it and I burned it. Made me feel better." I found out later that Percy had let her have the house and the contents. All he wanted was his precious work. He knew what Audrey would do. He went to tribunal over it, and he offered her Chris's dog and piano, which she adamantly refused, which was par for the course. And the mediator ordered her to give Percy all his work on the payment of 1 penny. But it didn't happen. My heart went out to PK, and I also had a lot of sympathy with Audrey. I think Percy had engineered that revelation. It could have been gentler. By this time I wanted to go. I knew about his cross-dressing, so that wasn't a shock. It was the manner of his departure and Audrey's attitude. There was acrimony and sheer cruelty there. My mind was in a whirl. "Thank you for telling me that, Audrey," I said. "I must go now. I've got to get back." "There's another one," she said. "Another what?" "Oil thing," she said. My heart leapt. "Where?" "It's in the kitchen behind the kettle." "What?" "Well, I can't hang it, can I?" she said. "Why not?" "Oh, go and fetch it." It was indeed behind the kettle, and it looked as though it had been there for decades, gathering dust and steam. It was dull. I picked it up. It was a plank of wood with a painting on it. It was a driftwood plank. It was lovely. Can you get that framed for me like them?" she said sweetly. "If you're driving up there, you might as well. Long way to Edinburgh." I turned the plank over. "Audrey," I said, "a frame is going to spoil this. It is what it is. It's beautiful." "But I want it framed like those," she said. "I can't hang it, can I?" I took it to Sean with the rest, a bit sheepishly, and Sean pounced on it. "Oh, this is fab," she said. I said, "the owner wants it framed like those." No, she said, "I'm not doing that. It'll spoil it. It's too lovely." "Why does she want it framed?" "She can't hang it." "Okay, I'll put some rings on the back and I'll string it." Years later, I saw another set of letters, this time letters that Percy had sent to Rosanna, who'd been at college with him. And I was delighted to read some he'd written to her from Newlyn in Cornwall in the early 60s. He used to go down to there every year to teach at a summer school. In one, he wrote about a driftwood plank he's picked up on the shore in Newlyn. Made my hair creep. He dried it out in the sun and borrowed some oil paints from one of the students and painted a boat on it. Well, I took it back to the bungalow after I got back from Edinburgh with a hammer and a picture hook. I went with great trepidation. I'm sorry, Audrey, I said, but the framer refused to do it. She said the same as I did. It really spoil it, you know, love. Audrey's lip curled. But I want it framed, she said. I told you. I'm not prepared to do that, Audrey, I said, and she scowled. Well, she said, you better sell it. I don't like it much anyway. Oh, can I buy it? What do you want for it? And it was agreed there and then. We shook hands, and I've removed the string and hooks, and I love it. Here are the other 6 oils. This is the Maryport from North Quay, one of Percy's favourite views. He used to sit down there drawing when he dropped Brian off at the Sea Cadets. This is the waterfront in Workington. When Percy was a child, he spent a lot of time down there. It wasn't that far from Corporation Road where he was born. And he went down there alone from a very early age. He'd be gone all day, nobody'd be concerned at all. His twin brother said he was about 3 the first time he went off on his own. But every Sunday, the Kelly family used to walk together after the Sunday service at the Methodist chapel, and they'd all have their best clothes on, a sort of volta as they do in Spain. But Percy could never wait to go back in his old clothes. The pink house on the right, by the way, is now a joiner's workshop. This one is just a marvellous composition. It just leads you in, doesn't it? It's almost abstract, but it's quite perfect. And here's Village in the Snow. I have tried in vain to identify this West Cumberland village, but I've given up, as it stands alone, and knowing where it is might spoil it or distract from its magic. The composition again is simple and perfect. And in fact, he did do a charcoal and chalk drawing of the same place. I bet you now, when this goes up on YouTube, somebody will recognise where it is and they'll tell me. And I'm not sure I really want to know. This is a masterpiece, Windy Day. I love those trees that are sort of crying out in distress with their arms raised to the sky. It's a beautiful piece of work, totally understated. And here's a charcoal call that I also titled Windy Day. It's one of the best charcoals he did in the 2 years, 1958 to 1960. He did a whole series, having acquired a ream of decent quality A2 paper. That was long before Lord Eccles gave him the Japanese paper. I wish he'd used it. But these charcoals were a breakthrough and got him through depression and a breakdown. And it's arguably the finest body of work he did. Audrey didn't come to the exhibition of the oil paintings in May 2003, when every one sold within hours. But she did turn up for the press photograph and the story of them being discovered in a Cockermouth loft. So Audrey did have her moment of fame. There's a surprise sequel to all this. When sorting and cataloguing way back in the 90s, I kept one of Percy's empty bread trays by me. I didn't discard a single thing. Well, the birdseed, mouse traps and stuff like that, I did, but not anything where Percy had made his mark. Not even school and college reports and letters from famous people who admired Percy's work. I showed Brian, but he wasn't interested at all. Is it worth anything, he said, scratching his head and looking puzzled. And if I said, not really, he'd say, chuck it, looking at me strangely as though I was unhinged. I still go through that box every now and again. When putting this video together, I remembered a piece of black hardboard in the tray. I went up and found it. just a few weeks ago. It was unlike the ones in Audrey's loft, because whatever had been on it was covered in an uneven, thick, cracked varnish. Perhaps a lacquer. Not sure what it was. It was terrible. It was like old city treacle. I took a photograph under strong light. I then enlarged it on the computer, and I lightened it as far as I dare. Yeah, there is something underneath. Is it a painting? Is it in oil paint? Will the varnish come off without damaging what's below it? If what's below it worth saving? Well, I can see all sorts of Percy things there. A cottage and a porch and one of his vertical poles, I can see him, dry stone wall, and a tree with its arms in the air in distress again. So I sent it down to a good restorer in Lancashire, and he rang me with a quote for removing the varnish when he'd seen it. He said, I'm 90% sure that I can remove the varnish, but if the painting underneath is water-based, you lose it, he said. Is that okay? I laughed. Well, I've had it nearly 30 years in the loft, I replied. Just do your best. Nothing to lose, have I? You have, he said. You'll still get me bill. I'm willing to take the risk, I told him. The floorboard sits on a shelf with my ceramic collection. I hope it will soon be joined by an oil on board. I'll let you know. Meanwhile, I await my next surprise, the next drama, perhaps another collection of letters. Who knows with Percy, whatever will turn up next? We'll just have to wait and see, won't we?